afternoon. You'll note, I think, just now that we are being recorded. So it's always a bit of a moment of slight intimidation, but you need not be intimidated. Yes, thank you. I hope that it's a pleasant day wherever you are and that you're not therefore not missing. Well, I'm contradicting myself. You're therefore missing out on nice weather outside, but more to the point, in this time of Zoom fatigue, it's always appreciated that you take time out of your day to join us. And it's especially appreciated that Banu has so generously donated her time and her thoughts to us. This is in fact the second time that she has participated so kindly in one of our events recently in the time of COVID. So thank you so much, Banu. I'll introduce her and her work, and then she'll speak for approximately 20 minutes, maybe a bit longer, maybe a bit less. So we have some visuals, and then I think we'll have ample time for discussion, which befits the nature of both the work and our predilections. So Banu Karaca works at the intersection of political anthropology and critical theory, art and aesthetics, nationalism and cultural policy, museum and feminist memory studies. You can see that she doesn't have very many interests at all. Her publications interrogate the freedom of expression in the arts, the visualization of gendered, the visualization of gendered memories of war and political violence, visual literacy and arts restitution. She's co-editor of Women Mobilizing Memory, published with Columbia University Press in 2019, and the author of, as I think everyone knows, since we're here to discuss it today, The National Frame, Art and State Violence in Turkey and Germany with Fordham University Press, published just this year, so hot off the proverbial presses. She's the co-founder of Siyabant, a research platform that documents censorship in the arts in Turkey, and has been visiting assistant professor of cultural studies at Sabancı University and faculty fellow at Columbia University's Center for the Study of Social Difference. Currently an EU-ME fellow at the Volkswagen Stiftung at Forum Transregionale Studien in Berlin. In Berlin. Banu is continuing her research on how looted and dispossessed art has shaped the legal and scholarly knowledge production on art in Turkey and the wider European context. So we're really pleased to welcome Banu again and look forward to your thoughts, and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, Jeremy, so much for the very kind invitation, and indeed to all of the participants of the Empires of Memory group. And I'm so pleased to be with you or share time with you one more time, once again. And thank you all for your interest. As Jeremy said, sort of for many of you, it's, I presume middle of the day or perhaps early in the day. So what I wanted to do, I understand that some of you might have read some chapters, some of you might not be familiar with the book at all. So it is sort of upon me, and it's not quite easy for me yet because it's all quite fresh yet, to share a little bit with you. I thought at the beginning how I came to do the research and the writing of this book, what sort of animated me or motivated me to start with that, and give you a little bit of an idea how I try to, as an anthropologist, how I try to approach art and how I look at art in the larger framework of state violence, and how I think the national frame keeps reinserting itself into even the contemporary art world at a time where the sort of global dimension of art is especially highlighted. I've prepared some visuals, and this is, bear with me, you know, because if we were in a room together, I don't think it would be so difficult if they were in the background, because they're not necessarily related at any certain point with what I'm saying. But I think, with your permission, I would turn them on and we'll see how that goes. And to some of them, I think we'll come back in the discussion for sure. So with your permission, I'd like to share my screen. And as I said, I wanted to sort of, okay, just a second. Yeah. limit my initial remarks to not too long of a time, and then have sort of an opportunity to come back to certain themes. Let me just see, you know what I just noticed? I don't know how to do this with, so it, okay. Now I know how to do this. Okay. Now I know how to do this. Okay, thank you. So the national frame emerged out of a long-term interest in art, aesthetics, and politics, and exactly about how, what types of different ways there might be in probing the relationship between art and politics, and how to understand the governance of art, and more generally in cultural policy, more particularly within sort of really putting the spotlight on questions of cultural policy within discussions of the politics of art. I've always been fascinated by the notion that art is inherently good. We could also say that art might be quite bad for you. And indeed, there are historical incidences and artworks where this is proposed, but generally there's a dominant understanding that art is inherently good. And there are many values accorded to art. And when I speak about these values accorded to art, I'm of course quite aware that individual artists speak of their own artistic practices and what it is that they're doing in quite different terms and with with a manifold formulations. But bear with me as I talk, as I sort of center at the beginning of our conversation a little bit this idea that these values that are accorded to art, for instance, that it furthers individual agency, critical faculties, that art has an emancipatory potential, and one topic that I will return to repeatedly is that art has a civilizing impact. So in contrast to these values accorded to art, I've always been fascinated with the daily workings of the art world as well. And I actually did, in between my master's studies, I did actually a stint in the art world for a few years, where I trained as a cultural manager in New York. It was mainly for the performing arts and dance related. But there I think at that time, I was very much struck by these ideals accorded to art. On the one hand side, the way in which artists spoke about their work, and the daily machinations, for instance, with which art is administered or managed in all kinds of arts institutions. So the national frame is then an attempt to grapple ethnographically with exactly these understandings of art. Again, that it has emancipatory potential, that art is a reflection of Enlightenment values and an avenue for critique or self-reflection. And it was also an attempt to sort of grapple with the way in which anthropology was approaching art at the time. It's been especially in the past 2 decades, the effects and affects of art, resistant practices and world-making practices that were foregrounded, and as always, I say with good reason. And also a very particular love affair between art and anthropology, in which a lot of anthropologists have increasingly likened the work of anthropology and the work of and artistic practice, which is something, if there's interest, we can talk more about. As I mentioned, this has engendered an emphasis on the transnational networks of people, monies, and things that characterize the intensified circulation of arts and artists that make the global art world. It has even meant that many commentators have seen the arts as a sort of model character, to have a model character for the precarity and the globality of the modern condition. Which should always give us pause also, I think. What emerged in my research and what I argue in the book is that it is very it is important to re-examine these emancipatory ideas of art, as they have been intrinsically bound up with the history of the nation state, and hence with our understandings of it, what it means to be modern or civilized. Because the national frame continues to delimit the boundaries of what is deemed acceptable or imaginable in the arts. So I'm not trying to talk about over-determining factors here. The national frame isn't an overly over-determining factor, but rather I connect the sort of, see the interpellation of art into the national frame through two, I will say for now two, we could also multiply that into three perhaps or more central dynamics. The first one takes up the notion of decivilizing moments by Norbert Elias. Norbert Elias himself saw in decivilizing moments, moments in which the seeming linearity of the civilizing process is called into question. And I apply this notion into moments in which the inherent goodness of art is challenged, and where the idealized connotations of art as a greater good are broken, and where the conditions, for instance, under which art is produced, bought, sold, circulated, and presented index a decivilizing moment. And here it's important to emphasize that Elias did not see the civilizing, although it's often misunderstood, the civilizing process as a linear and triumphal development, but as an imaginary of moral superiority that is fragile, always in danger of reversal, and ever so often of revealing the actual structural violence that it's predicated upon. So the book interrogates the assumption of the inherent goodness of art through, against, and across the national context of Turkey and Germany. And it does so by exploring exactly those instances that cast doubt on the assumed civilizing power of art. And among them are exclusionary narratives of national art histories that leave out subaltern or quote unquote minority voices or positions, censorship, and the role of economic dispossession in the assemblage of art collections, especially on the heels of genocidal violence. And I propose that different forms of state violence are as important to art, to understanding how sort of the art world functions, as is the foregrounding of its emancipatory potential. The second dynamic through which art is interpellated in the national frame is established by dispossession. The subject of dispossession has thus far, I think, been omitted in anthropological considerations of the contemporary art world. It's been more, it has been more widely applied within context of post-colonial art contexts and in the narrow field of indigenous art. And yet different kinds of symbolic, material, and economic dispossession have shaped the makeup of the contemporary art world in Germany and Turkey. So the book is really sort of centers, it's also not a coincidence that the book centers its analysis in the two cities of Istanbul and Berlin. Other combinations would have been, of course, possible. But in both of these cities, multiple kinds of dispossession are deeply intertwined with the history of art and its institutions. Again, the exclusion of quote unquote minorities from national art histories, the discounting of socialist art in a reunited Germany, and the link between large-scale economic expropriation on the heels of war and genocide, the Holocaust in the case of Germany and the Armenian genocide in Turkey, and other forms of state violence in the assemblage of art capital. And I think we'll talk a little bit in more detail later about that as well. That is capital. When I say art capital, I mean capital that sustains the art world and that sustains prominent art collections, all constitute practices of dispossession that are rarely discussed within interrogations of the contemporary art world in the way that they're really shaping the art world as we know it. And the only frequent or not the sometimes exception to this is Gentrification, which describes sort of the position or the role of art within urban space. My argument then is also that these processes of dispossession and how they connect art to the national frame remain largely obscured exactly because they circumstate decivilizing moments. They become tabooed in national art histories as moments that do not adhere to the civilizing narrative and that contradict idealized notions of the art. And at the same time, they also call art back into the complicity of the national frame. So if of interest, we can talk in a larger frame or at more length about the comparative perspective. I want to say make some introductory remarks about why Germany and Turkey together and how I think through this comparative perspective. So I propose that thinking through Turkey and Germany together allows for recognizing that the decivilizing capacities of art are as constitutive for our understanding of art as for the structural makeup of the art world. I want to say that this doesn't mean that the entire book is a horror story about art, but sometimes I did wonder if it was that. But it's much more that I try to situate sort of decivilizing moments within the daily workings of the art world. So the comparative look is at the art worlds of Berlin and Istanbul is motivated by the notable similarities in how cultural policies have been formulated in Germany and Turkey, as both contexts have struggled with art as a vehicle for expressing modern nationhood. And indeed, I have to say that for me, when I started this project, I was actually quite by coincidence at that time, now it's of course a classic, came across Martin Stokes' The Arabesque Debate. And what I was very struck by is that sort of his, although cultural policy is not necessarily at the center of that wonderful ethnomusicological book, what he was relaying about in his analysis of cultural policy in Turkey really reminded me of the cultural policy presets that I had experienced growing up in Germany. And this sort of parallelism was for me the first hook that drew me into the question of how different are these cultural policies of Germany and Turkey. And you know, the sort of the trope of the radical alternative between Germany and Turkey is of course very strong and very familiar for those of us who live within these or live and work within these sort of European contexts. So the congruencies are all the more striking when we consider that current art from Germany and Turkey is evaluated differentially, mirroring the place that each country occupies in dominant geopolitical and civilizational imaginaries that continue to construe the world in terms of quote unquote West and East, or more recently, and with more recently I now mean the past 20 years, Christianity and Islam as separate and incommensurable entities. Despite this very differential perception, I encountered a shared vocabulary with regard to the social, political, and cultural function of art when talking to artists, to policymakers, to critics, funding agencies, and others engaged in the art world. The commonalities of these vocabularies were most pronounced whenever there was a conflict over the form, content, or instrumentalization of art. All objections and criticisms were invariably thought of using one master narrative, and that is all we're trying to do is to contribute to the greater good. So the mediating discourse of the greater good, that although sometimes it invokes a sort of universalist humanity, generally is employed with an attendant in the art world and that attendant is the needs of the people that is most of the time explicated in national terms. Of course, these national terms might differ, and how national populations are envisioned might differ. But national particularity inserts itself into these discourses of the greater good. It is through this dynamic that the national prism continues to refract, not only, but also through this dynamic that the national prism continues to refract the production and reception of art, even for artists and other actors in the art world who employ the national as an analytical lens for critique. I had prepared a little bit to tell you a little bit more about the field work, but let me perhaps come to 2 points. Let me sort of leave the fieldwork part for now a little bit apart. If that's of interest, I'm more than happy to talk a little more about it in detail. Let me see if, and also about the sort of inherent contradictions of the modern conception of art that I'm sort of working throughout the book. I can talk about that a little bit more in our discussion as well, if there's interest. But let me perhaps say a few more words about trying to think through the cases of Germany and Turkey together. So let me just, so it doesn't let me do that. But here, of course, I want to come back to these 2 slides I have from the video work by Şener Özmen and Erkan Özgen, Road to the Tate Modern, which has always helped me think about and keep my humor about the sort of enduring asymmetry of perception. Some of you might be familiar with it, but in this video, Şener Özmen and Erkan Özgen as modern day versions of Don Quixote and Sancho Panza ride through the landscape of Turkish Kurdistan. And ever so often they stop when they meet someone to ask along the way, to ask how to reach the Tate Modern. And the frame that you're seeing now is where they meet a shepherd in the mountains, and he describes to them that the way is quite far. On which the two reply, do you think we can make it? And the shepherd says, yes, I think you can make it. Just keep going. And of course, this is a commentary of both of the sort of double periphery that artists like Özmen and Özgen, who both are among a larger group of artists, contemporary artists, who have decided or have chosen to stay and work and produce from Diyarbakır rather than moving to Istanbul, Ankara, or Izmir. And sort of to produce from the war-torn, now again differently war-torn, then also war-torn landscape of Turkish Kurdistan, but also the enduring asymmetric perception that anyone producing from within the borders of Turkey has to navigate. The sort of the trope that long existed about contemporary artistic, not just modern Turkish art, but contemporary artistic production from Turkey all throughout the 1990s and 2000s, it was often described as a sort of contemporary art from Turkey was described as merging, quote unquote, modern and traditional Turkish art, was seen as a fusion thereof. Or we could also say it was more seen as ethnic cultural production rather than art. The newer iteration, I think, of this that we see more recently is the sort of trope that Turkish art is quote unquote political, which can be read in many ways, but I take to, especially within international or European encounters, This often translates into meaning that, quite in contrary to German art, which is just unmarked art, so to speak, Turkish art is political. Turkish art is political, meaning that it's mainly concerned with local or national conditions. So I see this idea, or this much cited trope of Turkish art being also political, as a reiteration of this peripheral to modernity discourse. In contrast, German art, as I said, is now understood as unquestionably modern. But now, for me, is always the operative term, since this has not always been the case, not least in the official German imagination, in which, for instance, modernism in the arts was long identified as decidedly un-German. And, in the first chapter of the book, some of the work that I do there is exactly show how Germany's Westernness was very contingent and long embattled within Germany itself. It was not until not until the second part of the 1950s, I would say, that West Germany then adopted explicitly Occidental cultural policies to transcend long-standing anti-Western and anti-modernist currents as part of its post-World War rehabilitation. And it's very interesting that when you look closer, you find a plethora of narratives that will tell you the story of Germany with a very contingent idea or very unstable idea of the questioning of how Western Germany really is, or how Germany actually became part of the West. I always found that one of the things that makes this asymmetric perception even more notable is that Turkey embarked on aligning itself artistically with the West as early as 1923, especially as Ottoman art, like all aspects of its cultural landscape, were deemed unfit for the modern nation state. A few other when we talk about convergences and divergences, a few parallels between Germany and Turkey that I just want to point to here, not to make haphazard parallels or equate everything, but what I try to do with the book is to say it is worth pausing on these issues. Even if and to really cut through this asymmetric perception. So I work through the question of the belated arrival on the nation state scene. That's a big theme in Turkish and German nationalism and in debates on the arts. Authoritarian governing structures, which both national contexts shared for a long time. How the ideas of cultural commonality and ethnicity have shaped debates on the arts. And how, for instance, this distinction to foreign civilizations and discredited civilizations of the past have in turn shaped debates on the arts. In the German case, for a long time, France was the formative other, and after World War II, it becomes then Nazi Germany. For Turkey, it has long been the Ottoman Empire, and of course, we can also talk about the last decade, how that has perhaps shifted. And I trace at the beginning of the book to both set the stage for this. I say comparative, but again, comparative is actually a shorthand to say I'm thinking through and with and against these national contexts to understand really how art is constituted politically and socially and historically in both contexts. So as I talk about the historical legacies and the doubts and insecurities that both national contexts face regarding their modernness, or have faced, some in the past, sometimes it's still in the present. I should also point out that the intention is not to perpetuate tropes of exceptionalism, which are both very marked for Germany and for Turkey. In Germany, that's the Sonderweg, the special path, with which Germany's modernization process has often been described. And in Turkey, for Turkey, it's been this trope of the continual belatedness that to some extent, unfortunately, continues to prevail in engagements within Turkey. Quite to the contrary, sort of these two discourses of exceptionalism. I'm sort of interested in how these two discourses of exceptionalism have served to obscure a range of political predicaments and inequities in both national contexts, and how these have been so vitally reflected in the governance of art. And that should also give a little bit of an answer, although these discussions have interestingly receded into the background a little bit when I sort of embarked on the study. One of the big questions was always like, am I talking about alternative modernities or multiple modernities and so on? And my sense was that it was none of these things, that this was really an effort of thinking about modernity in the truest sense as connecting places and people in faraway places intimately with each other, seemingly faraway places, and that modernity is always an encompassing project. That doesn't mean that everything is the same everywhere, but I'm very much interested in this shared trajectory, encompassing politics, society, and culture in divergent locations within the normative frame. And in the case of Germany and Turkey, I should, before I close, also say that there's also an important intimacy that I sort of fold into this comparative working through the both contexts. And I was a little bit guided by this thought, why do we have to think, why do we have comparable things, need comparable things, or comparative thinking, or thinking through two supposedly separate entities together? Does it really mean we have to be separating them? Can we account for different kind of shared histories or entanglements, as they're often called today? So I was very much interested also in these different stories that happen in the background, on the long and troubling exchanges between the Germanys and the Ottoman Empire, and then contemporary Germany and Turkey, and how this longer history that has very interesting implications, for instance, with regard to cultural policy in Germany, have been neglected, forgotten, and how this forgetting has, to Drawn and Stoller, which I also draw in the book, engendered a certain, has allowed for a constant unfamiliarity and incomparability to be postulated, because it is that is grounded in a very specific kind of forgetting. So let me just close here, and what I've sort of told you about so far is a little bit the first part of the book, where I just set up, where I felt I had to set up this introductory, the comparative framing of the book, or what it means for me to compare and think through Germany and Turkey together. And perhaps we could just have a conversation from here on out, or you can ask me things and ask me anything.
Thank you so much, Banu. I'm going to encourage you perhaps not to mute yourself. I should say, just for the reference of those of us who are not in our Empires of Memory group, that we did, in preparation for this, read the introduction and chapters 1 and 4 of Banu's book. I myself am immensely eager to read the remainder of it. I have a whole series of questions and shared concerns that I think I could probably take up the rest of our time. We have ample time for.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you, Jeremy. I should just briefly say, for those of you who didn't have a chance to look at the book, I should just very briefly say that what I try to do in the different chapters, so you've heard a little bit from the introduction and from the first chapter. The second chapter is a sort of little tour de force through the art world that looks at all the different players that are, not all of them, but that looks at how artists conceptualize their work versus people who sponsor art and how they talk about what they say, sort of not necessarily behind closed doors, but how they explain the way in which they are engaged in the art, how those who collect make sense of collecting, how gallerists frame their relationships to artists. Chapter 3 is, I always call it the nerd chapter because it's more specifically about cultural policy. That might not be interesting for everyone. I love that stuff. And it's a sort of trying to retell specific, not, I'm not a historian, so I'm not giving a history of cultural policy, but I'm trying to, I sort of concentrate on certain moments that I think might give us a very different perspectives on telling the stories of how art has been governed in Germany and Turkey. And chapter 4, I'm slipping into German. Chapter 4 is about sort of memory work in the arts and how memory work both in terms of remembrance and in terms of the work of forgetting, and how arts institutions are engaged in constructing forgetting and remembrance, and how also artists, and some of the examples that you've seen, how artists work against certain kinds of amnesia and bring in different kinds of remembrances through their own works and practices. Chapter 5 is about different modalities of censorship and how censorship very often goes back to, again, episodes of state violence that are tabooed. I use tabooed not in a very deep, it's actually not something that I shouldn't say that, I don't know why I use it twice today. It's not a, not an expression that I use in the book itself very much. In there, I'm really very much interested how the sort of decivilizing moments in the histories of Turkey and Germany all of a sudden then become moments in which censorship is enacted very visibly in Turkey and very invisibly, interestingly, in Germany. That doesn't mean that there isn't censorship in Germany, but interestingly, in a context where everyone thinks that they're free, that everything is free, censorship also becomes very hard to discern. It's one of the arguments that I'm doing, sort of foregrounding there. And the 6th chapter looks at the sort of, looks at art in urban space through a couple of lenses. It sort of takes the biennials and that both cities host as an entry point to think about how both, again, how art is sort of very often located, or arts institutions are very often located in spaces that have been freed up or made into, freed up in quotation marks, of course, or have been made into voids by genocidal violence and other structural kinds of state violence, and how the sort of spectacularization and of art and the enterprising of art and the aestheticization of business constantly veil and disavow the kinds of violence that very often facilitate art in urban space. And in the end, the conclusion, rather than being a conclusion, it comes back to more contemporary encounters between Germany and Turkey. And I end with some of the more recent sort of developments that I found quite interesting, where I once again see how the national frame tries to call art back to certain positions, where I talk about recent developments in Germany and Turkey that engender what I think are the war against artistic memory that I see very prevalent in both contexts at the moment. So, yeah. Sorry, Jeremy, maybe
No, no, not at all. I
a
think,
little bit of an arc in terms of what I tried to do.
well, your remarks function doubly to entice those of us who have read some, but not yet perhaps all of the book, and then to summarize for all of us aspects that we haven't yet had a chance to engage in. Probably we'll ask some questions and raise some topics that you address already quite thoroughly. That's always the case. I think if it's okay with everyone, I might just take the prerogative of raising a few themes and questions. As I said, I could probably ask you questions all day, Banu, but I'll try to limit myself to two or maybe 2.5, and then we can simply, if you have a question, just turn on your mic and maybe raise your Zoom hand, as it were. So what I wanted to sort of open up for further discussion with you and with all of us, Banu, are a couple of themes. First, I was hoping you might say a bit more about this rather fascinating sort of the insistence of a particularity to Turkish art, in the sense that the frame is sort of tighter for Turkish art than it is for German art, right? German art is no longer framed as German necessarily. It can be this sort of universal. And the way that frame in Turkey has become one of this sort of political art, specifically moving from the sort of ethnic traditional to the political, that's quite fascinating and rings intuitively true. And I guess my question is how one moves to interpret that a bit further. Why is it that the political in relationship to Turkish art, and it's probably true of other sort of contexts outside of the heartlands of modernity, as it were, are also it's also incumbent upon them to be political. It seems to me that almost signals this sort of latent Kantianism, whereby the purity of the aesthetic is only available to producers in certain locations with certain sort of subjective sensibilities, and everywhere else the aesthetic has to be supplemented by something that's not merely aesthetic. Of course, we've deconstructed all of that, as you nicely do in the book, but I just, it's a very curious sort of phenomenon that one sees with regard to Turkey, but elsewhere as well. So I wondered if you might comment on that. The second main topic that I want to bring up is related in a way, and in some ways it also reflects my own recent peregrinations, quixotic perhaps even after Sancho and Dawn. I've been talking to a lot of art historians, particularly here in Croatia. I'm in Zagreb, as I think many of you know. And I often find that we sort of speak past one another, even though we have this very similar sort of fascination with the aesthetic, precisely because art history, at least as I understand it, and please, I beg the forgiveness of those of you who are more art historically trained than I am, but there is this insistence on a genealogy that is aesthetic rather than political, right? And rather than political economic. And so I guess the question very generally to you, Banu, is how do you respond to the, so I would find myself often in these conversations really in quite naive and brutal ways, trying to make the sort of arguments that you so elegantly make in this book about the sort of relationship between state practice, governance, violence, and dispossession, and the production of art. And yet that never quite satisfies the sort of discourse of the aesthetic genealogy and the aesthetic that still grounds the discipline of art history. So I guess I'm on one simplistic level interested in how you respond to that challenge to the degree that it comes to you, but on another level, how generally we think about the aesthetic after we politicize it in the way that you have in this book. The last sort of secondary or tertiary topic would be a question as to how you think your argument would apply, would it change, would it remain the same if you took on a somewhat different domain of aesthetic production, not high art, as it were, or the international art market, but rather something like decorative art or architecture, of course, modern music. It would be interesting to think through how that might shift certain themes and arguments, but I'll stop there because I think that's already enough to begin the conversation.
I mean, all of these questions deserve much, much longer answers, but let me just ever so brief, like try to be brief and yet concise. I think perhaps we can combine a few things, or I try to combine a few things, because what you say, we have a wonderful Gisam Tongo, I see you here, a wonderful art historian from which I continue to learn so much. We've never personally met, but it's lovely to see you on screen. For me, I think what anthropology can do well, and what I'm interested in from where I'm standing, is that I see all of these approaches as different ways of trying to tell the story of art, right? So for me, it's not about, is that correct, or do we have to, of course, sometimes these approaches can collapse. I've learned a tremendous amount from my art historical colleagues over the past few years, because I had opportunities of exchanges, also institutionalized exchanges at the forum and so on. But of course, as an anthropologist, I'm very much interested in the modalities of the knowledge production on art, and art history there is a very, very important point. On the other hand, it's also one way of telling the history of art, right? Philosophy of art plays a role also within that. And there's different ways of telling this, the history, different art historical approaches as well. So for me, all of that is extremely interesting. I always find it very important when I hear also the insistence on the aesthetic, I think tells us a lot, right? And I see all of these, including anthropological approaches or other approaches to art, exactly within what I try to sort of, I try to open up that whole spectrum in the introduction of the book, and then come back to it a few more times, which is what I say is this, the inherent paradoxes and contradictions in the modern conception of art, which I would propose is really the ways in which, when we say today art, it means, it brings together all these different traditions of thinking about the aesthetic that are historically discrete, that have very particular own genealogies, but we shorthand and merge them when we say art very often, just to exercise it through for those of you who didn't have a chance to look at it. I find it really interesting, one way of sort of telling the story of how we came to understandings of art that are sort of dominant and perhaps more or less common among us today is, we can tell the story, for instance, of the art market and how art became increasingly seen as the product of an individual genius rather than a rendering of a world out there, or an abstraction of a world out there, or of divine beauty, right? When we look at the late 18th century, and of course this is, and we can discuss this also, of course this is a very particular way of telling the story of art, but I think it's one that is constantly called upon in contemporary discussions. What we call art today becomes very recognizable, I think, in that moment when art becomes anchored in the art market in the form that we know is very recognizable to us today, which is the later 18th century, probably in the commodification of literature. And from there on in, something very interesting happens. Exactly at the moment when art becomes anchored in the market, there's this Kantian notion and other notions like that art should be not interested in anything but itself. It's exactly at that point where it becomes a more recognizable commodity as such, right? We could also go to the Renaissance and tell a different story. We could, go to a completely different art environment and tell a different story. But where these stories are sort of merging towards then becomes very interesting and very sort of shared. The idea that art reflects something that is shared in all of us, that is shared in humanity. But all of a sudden, that also means that art needs education. It's both a shared experience and yet an area of expertise. It belongs to all of us, but yet it can be accumulated in private hands. It's a common good. And it can only be protected as a common good, I mean, in my new project, I sort of come to understand much more that in times of war, art can only be protected when, no, sort of the other way around. Even public art can only be protected if it's private property. But art as private property leaves us with all these, yeah, with this yucky feeling somehow, yeah. Yeah, because art belongs to everyone. So if someone comes and buys something away, you know, or when the Belvedere had to give back the Klimt to the survivor of the sole survivor of Maria Altmann's family, you know, the whole discourse was, you know, the art world of Austria is about to collapse because it's now going to a private person and is no longer on public view, right? So I think these contradictions, for me, you know, both anthropological approaches to this question as well as art historical approaches to these questions are just other ways of trying to tell the story. So I'm not, my issue is not to argue against art history, but to both understand the story that I'm trying to tell, and sort of bring it in dialogue with these different stories, to have a sort of working engagement with art and aesthetics, I think, if that makes sense at all. You know, what you were saying about is sort of the frame tighter for Turkish art. Yes and no. I think in the way it is tighter, is exactly tighter in the way that you have talked about, and you know, many artists from the sort of so-called what longer was called the non-West in the art world, or it was called peripheries, or now it's called the global South, you know, and all these different sort of designations have many stories to tell, you know, and at the end, towards the end of the book, I come back to some of these episodes. There was in Berlin the famous Focus Istanbul scandal, where, you know, it was very on vogue for a while to do these regional exhibitions in Europe about the Balkans and then, you know, the Middle East or God knows where. Sorry, if you're hearing someone screaming, it's, you know, the streets are alive, what can I tell you? And there's discontent on the streets of Kreuzberg because of a police raid. But so there's many stories. Qintao Wu has written about this quite beautifully. I think in different formations about East Asian art, for instance, but not only. But when I came to the Focus Istanbul scandal, it was very interesting because, you know, this was supposed to be a different kind of exhibition. It wasn't supposed to be one of those regional exhibitions. And then it turned out into, the exhibition in 2005 turned into a big scandal, because what came out is that participating artists from Istanbul were unhappy about the Orientalist framing of the exhibition. They had heard that their German colleagues, who also were contributing, for instance, were paid to come to Istanbul to create new works, while they were supposed to give already existing works to the exhibition. And I mean, there's much to say about that scandal, quote unquote, including that when Turkish artists protested this, the curators said that their collective protest was sort of exemplary for the corporatist character of Turkish culture. So, you know, even their protest wasn't then even recognizable as a sort of solidarity building protest, anti-racist, anti-Orientalist protest. And it was very interesting, you know, when, and the curators in the interviews that I did kept telling me, you know, how they had, you know, put in such an effort, and they had learned about Turkey and the art scene. And of course, but what they had learned is basically that narrative of belated modernization in the Turkish art world, you know. And so in a moment of crisis, what came out with this very well-intentioned exhibition, which was supposed to not do all the things it did, was exactly that it reproduced the very sort of innate racist Orientalist patterns that exist. And, you know, there's, over the years, the stories, and perhaps many of you have also, you know, have been relayed these stories. And I'm thinking, if you just allow me just to give a few more examples, other projects, for instance, are more performative. I wouldn't say performance, but a more performative working group based in Istanbul. For a while they didn't take any invitations from Western European countries, because every time they arrived, they were sort of expected to do work with immigrant populations in Copenhagen or in Oslo, sort of to be with do work with their people, or I mean, this is sort of is recounted again and again. In that way, it is tighter. But at the same time, for artists from Turkey. But what I would also say is that in Germany, because there is this idea unequivocally that one is part of the Western quote unquote art world, the way in which the national frame itself inserts itself is much more veiled. And we see this especially, for instance, with the discussion that I pick up in chapter 5 about the exhibition on the Red Army faction. Right, where a group of curators, very prolific curators, try to take on the history of the German militant left. And all of a sudden find themselves confronted with a kind of resistance that becomes very hard to decipher when you believe that, when you sort of believe in the image of Germany as unencumbered by these taxonomies and political workings that Turkey supposedly is subject to, in contrast to Germany. So I would qualify it like that. So decorative art, I don't want to go into that because I don't believe in the category of decorative art. I don't think there is. Gizem can answer to this more from an art historical perspective. I find the idea of decorative art sort of weird. This is not to say that, like I have trouble dealing with it, because I think what we call decorative art today is very probably something quite different at another point in time. Architecture, of course, there's a lot written about this, and there's, it's a specialty, and and Esra Akcan has beautifully written about the kind of translation, for instance, between the German and Turkish context and so on and so forth. And but I always find I have a lot to learn from architectural historians, because, in architecture, this sort of joining of aesthetics and art history and engineering sort of is a very fruitful ground of passing out some of these the stories that we tell, about ourselves in terms of to ourselves about ourselves, to use the Goethean formulation when it comes to art, that ever so briefly. But thank you so much, Jeremy, for the questions. You're really, I'm sorry, you got me going, and I think I answered too long.
And I would have at least 3 or 4 more now, but I see Gizem and Sultan both. So Gizem, please, and then Sultan, and then we'll take it from there.
Hi all, I'm Banu. It's lovely meeting you virtually, and I'm really looking forward to reading your book. I mean, it sounds fascinating. I was very excited when I saw the invitation. And I think we have a lot to talk about in the future. So I won't ask you many questions. Just, like as an author, I'm wondering, what is the thing that surprised you most after you finish your book? Like, what's the thing that after you did research that you were not expecting that result? Or I'm wondering, as an author, Yeah.
Oh, Gizem, you're asking a very difficult question. Yeah, no, it's a beautiful question, because I think I sometimes sort of, when I started out, I didn't think state violence would be a big topic at all. I actually was just interested in sort of thinking through together what these two paths of contending with modernization and sort of claiming a kind of national art and the making of national art, how that played out in the present. So I was very interested in how, historically speaking, these fascinating parallels would lead me, you know, how they were shaping present conditions of making and showing art and talking about art and writing about art and looking at art, you know, and engaging with art. But yeah, I mean, it's not that state violence wasn't sort of there at all, but I was a little bit surprised how much it's structured, you know, to the extent of which, and actually I'm saying something wrong, because when I say how much it's structured, and that led me then to the project that I'm doing now, is actually how state violence is so constitutive for the art world as we know it today. So it's not an aberration, but it's really for the structural makeup of the art world is of course what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about artistic production per se, but for the structural makeup of the art world, that it's so central, and the disavowal of this violence is so central. You know, not just the violence itself, but the constant need to disavow this constitutive violence is so central, not just for colonial collections, right? But even for the kind of contemporary collections that we're looking at today. I think that was one of the most central things. And thank you so much, Gizem. And we'll talk more. And
yeah, I will send you an email.
Thank
you, Banu.
so much.
Sultan.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Jeremy and Max Planck team for organizing this. And yeah, Banu, it's such an exciting book. I mean, I have to admit, I only read the introduction, and like, you know, your presentation today actually made me want to read everything now. I felt like I want to see all these images. I want to just get into that. I really love your conceptual take. I see it as a conceptual take, and that's actually a question, because you say you were struggling with like these two sides that you basically try to connect beyond the comparison of asymmetries and inequalities, but in fact show like how certain things work quite similarly and are constitutive of the art world. And, you know, also like what you just said now to Gizem, I think the disavowal of violence. What you know, I actually have two very concrete questions. One is, and I hope you know, allow me to ask that question in such bluntness. I want you to talk about your positionality. I'm just so impressed. You know, I was with my own dissertation project. In the beginning, I thought I'd do this transnationally, Turkey, Germany comparison. And early on, I was like, you know, no, I can't handle this. There's just so much to juggle. And the reason I'm asking is that in the introduction, you have these two quotes where you ask two different art experts how the art world works in Germany and Turkey, and if it's different. And, you know, like what you quote there is just so telling, how this supposedly very universal context is actually far more guarding, right? And that supposedly particular context is actually far more connected in narrative, right? So, and but the question that I have with that is that there's also Banu Karaca, who grew up in Germany and who can enter these worlds as an art expert, as an anthropologist, as someone who speaks German, Turkish, English quite well. So how did you get to, like, I'm just like both, give me all the ingredients, the tools, no, but also like intellectually, I think this is an intellectual position that not everyone can have, even if they were doing this as a comparison. So how did that basically structure your lens in doing this work early on, or did it come later? This is question one. And the second question is about actually making art. Since you also showed Erkan Özgen's work, and he's someone I really admire, because I think of him as a humble artist. I think of him as a craftsman. And he told me once that he's a teacher. You know, actually, he's just a teacher in Diyarbakir, but he also happens to make art. So the question here is that how do certain particular histories and productions of making something tangible, a world tangible, actually travel beyond Diyarbakir, beyond Istanbul, all the way to Berlin and London and to Tate Modern, right? Because there's also this constant conversion of the frame that, and this is the actual question, does that actually expand the national frame, or does the national frame stay? And yes, I mean, all of this just to say, I'm really thrilled you have this book, and I look forward to seeing more of your work.
Thank you so much, Sultan, for your kind words. And we will celebrate all your accomplishments and publications very soon. I'm very sure, as we have often always only briefly, but had time to commiserate. Let me start with the second question. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a very well posed question, and in terms of, does the national frame stay? And you're absolutely right. What I'm saying is that the national, I think what I have to clarify is that I don't think the national frame delimits a specific kind of artwork or the making of art everywhere at every point. But what I was interested in is sort of looking, and I'm also not negating the life that individual artworks have, some of which, I've shared with you that I came, that have stuck with me throughout this research. They have very different lives in very different places or at different times. I think of Erkan's work over the past 20 years. And I think what kind of lives a lot of his works have today versus 20 years ago, and where they have these lives, both within the boundaries of Turkey and in other places. And of course, the road to the Tate Modern is now part of the Louvre, Centre Pompidou collection, and it has been shown at the Tate, which was quite unimaginable at the time when they did this work. So for me, the national frame is not this I understand that it's a little bit, and I have opened that up myself by giving it that, both the title and by using this as my main conceptual device. But what I don't mean here is to over-determine works of art. So the national frame is not something that sticks to the artwork itself, but rather is more about the many institutional spaces, theories, about the power relations, about the conditions in which art is circulated and presented and produced in terms of the living conditions sort of artists and what they have to contend with on a daily basis. So perhaps that clarifies a little bit. So I hope that clarifies that a little bit. The more difficult question that you're asking is about the positioning. And I would say it was less that I struggled with bringing Germany and Turkey together, but, well, I say this and this is not quite true. Because when I said, and that's why I mentioned that at the beginning, my first interest, I wasn't interested at all in working between Germany and Turkey at all. I was actually like, never again, I'm going to do something, I'm going to work on the US, I had all these ideas. But when something really, I should perhaps write Martin Stokes a thank you note, but when I read that book, I was so extremely struck. by the parallels that I saw there. And it sort of changed my whole thinking about what cultural policy is, and sort of, it allowed me to sort of really work against this. It was for me an anchor point to how we can work against these weird ideas that are so stick to us so much and that are so structuring of many of our everyday lives and of our scholarly thinking about this idea of radical alterity, right? So that's one point of the story. And once you open that door, all of a sudden you see these connections between the Germanys and the Ottoman territories and all these other voices that have been telling other stories for a long time, you know, Lisa Jardin and Jeremy Broughton's Global Interests was a book like that, where all of a sudden the Renaissance becomes a completely different story, not the story of an Ottoman Empire that fell behind, but of this very extreme interlocution, the Age of Beloveds by Walter Anderson and Mehmet Kalpak, you know, this about that, how these ideas, how artistic ideas circulated within the Mediterranean region all the way up to Britain about, you know, love between two men and divine love and recreational drug use, as we would say today. But, you know, all of this, how this was a topic that united the artistic language, this exchange and these mutually recognizable sort of artifacts, symbols, artworks, and so on. So that's, once that story opens up, that's of course interesting, but then comes exactly the point. And I think that's a harder question for me to formulate very neatly. And I hope I know you understand, but bear with me. So once someone like who's called Banu Karaca says, this is what I'm going to do, everyone thinks you're enacting some kind of identity drama, which is perhaps not untrue, but also not a problem, I think, you know, because you know, men have been enacting their identity dramas for a very long time in this kind of work, as many of us perhaps do, you know. I was sort of, I had braced myself for certain possibilities, but what I was confronted with was something quite different. And that was less the part in Turkey where I had foreseen, you know, like I mean, you have to understand that when I did my initial research, not the real fieldwork stuff, but when I did my initial research, I mean, I was speaking, and these are all parts of these stories. I was speaking with Turkish from the 1960s, which is the time when my parents left Turkey. Yeah. So, and that's what the kind of Turkish everyone was speaking where I was growing up. I should have gotten formal Turkish education when I was a child, but I was taken out of formal Turkish class because, and this is all part of the story, because it turned out that the Turkish teacher was an Islamicist who had to flee from Turkey after the 1980 coup. And when my mother noticed that we weren't learning Turkish, but we were learning Islamic prayers, she yanked me out of that class. This tells you a lot. I mean, in this little anecdote from my life, there's a lot to tell about Germany, Turkey, the 1980s coup, and so on and so forth, and how when people came over here. So all of these, I mean, you know, but I think for me, and I had sort of expected that when I was going to Turkey, everyone would think of me as an Almanca, and this is how I would be treated. And that was sometimes the case. That wasn't also too surprising. What I was more surprised about is at that point, I had sort of left Germany for quite some time. And I thought, you know, just gonna go and speak perfect German. And I mean, perfect German. I mean, that formulation alone is ridiculous. I mean, it's my mother, it's my first language. So what could be possibly so hard? But I didn't anticipate, even if I didn't say I'm doing something comparatively about Istanbul and Berlin, which seemed to agitate a lot of people. The problem seemed to be more that I was trying to do something about German cultural policy, German art. That seemed to be the problem most of the time. And as I say in the introduction, there was a certain point where a lot of these encounters I felt they were costing me too much, you know, because I mean, you go to a curator and you want to talk about how they see their work in the gallery, how they position themselves vis-a-vis the official cultural policy of the German state and the city policy of Berlin, which were quite different at the time. But they want to tell you about how their quote-unquote Turkish neighbor is not allowing his or her daughter to wear a mini skirt, or, you know, that they're veiled or unveiled, or, you know, integration, how well you're integrated or not integrated into the German society. and I'm not being hyperbolic here. I mean, there was a reason why I decided at some point not to conduct the interviews in German anymore. After the first 2 months, it was just, I sort of asked, I asked for advice. I hadn't asked for advice, really. I think I had just written to Don Robotham, you know, and at the Graduate Center, and I said, this is getting really out of hand. Like every time I'm trying to do an interview or, you know, go somewhere, this becomes a real thing. You know, it's not just like 2 sentences, but a larger discussion. And I sort of felt it would make it easier on people if they just thought I was someone from Turkey, rather than an immigrant kid who had returned in a different form. I don't know, does that answer a little bit your question, Sultan? I mean, as you see, I mean, you opened up Pandora's box, and I can go on quite about this for a while, but that's the way I sort of managed to navigate that. I'm sure there's more to tell there. And also more, perhaps even more reflective things to say, I'm not sure. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you.
Thank you, Banu. I think we all feel very strongly that this insight is both incredibly valuable and also, you know, we empathize to the degree that we can. Yelena, I see that you have your hand up, so I'll stop here.
Thank you so much. This was really such a great, enjoyable read. And I was struck by how art history is really similar to just the regular history in ways it forgets and remembers some things. And it is also different because of this aesthetic dimension that somehow can swallow so many contradictions that, I mean, even when in art history there were real anti-civilizational, anti-artistic movements, like in the interwar period, they were somehow, they always get incorporated just in the regular art history. What I was wondering about was, I'm really interested in these issues of modernity, modernization, civilization in general, and the notion of belated modernity, which of course applies to the research of so many of us. Is there, I mean, in the way that belated modernity is in this story interwoven with art history making and art procedures in Turkey and Germany, does it make them in sort of special cases? Or is it something that is applicable to other contexts? And if we say, well, most of the world has an issue of belated modernity, what about the West-West that was already the West for these cases? Isn't art history there as well implicated with state violence?
Yeah, I'll again take it from the back. I think any kind of knowledge production or art that doesn't address this is, of course, implicated in this kind of violence. You know, in my current work, it's a lot about how some strands of the telling of the history of quote unquote Islamic art becomes complicit in state violence because it invests into knowledge-making practices that deny the existence of non-Muslims, for instance, within the late Ottoman Empire. In that way, I think knowledge production is always complicit. It's also very much complicit, I think, when it perpetuates this idea of, in the case of Turkey, for instance, belated modernity, which is an investment into an idea that constantly displaces inequalities and political issues upon a sort of temporal scale, rather than making them about what they really are, right? So, you know, sometimes people ask me, could you have done the same thing with, let's say, Turkey and France? Or could you have done the same thing with France and England? Or something like that. And I think you can say similar things, but I think, and I say this with a lot of trepidation, when you look at it from Germany, and I say this very consciously, you know, I'm not saying this, I'm no specialist about the discussions in France or in England or so on. But the topic of the sort of civilizational discourse is a different one that I think all of these within Western Europe and beyond a lot of places contend with, especially when it comes to art. I do wonder if within the French context, they had these sort of very tortured discussions about if they late to anything, you know? I mean, I'm sure they're late. Sometimes they're late because the Spaniards first put, you know, something, you know, and go and sail around whatever the world. Instead, I think within, of course, within the modern condition, there is belatedness as a discontent and as a sort of motive, sort of weird motivator to that brings to ever more violent excess is, of course, built in within the normative frame of modernity itself, I would say. But I don't want to lean out too much out of the window. But if you ask, you know, from the German position, those English and those French, they never had to contend with this, you know. Interestingly, they don't say, oh, the Spaniards or the Italians didn't have to contend with this. I mean, you know, where the gaze is sort of fixated on and who the formative other is. And that's why I couldn't help myself, but, you know, and I always do. I love Thomas Nipperday's History of Germany that begins with, in the beginning was Napoleon. You know. Because, of course, the German story about itself has nothing to do with Napoleon. It has to do with the German spirit that was bound to bring together all these, you know, principalities. And you know, and the question is, why did it take us so long to get united? You know, why was it not until 1871? Why didn't we manage earlier? And is that why we don't really have a German art, you know? Why we have this Mediterranean art, the Catholic tradition, and then this Protestant thing that we don't know what to do with. I'm making this into a little, perhaps, I'm breaking it down into, of course, you know, I not to make light of it, but just to sort of open up this constant back and forth, you know. And I think what I was hoping is, if that's of interest at all, what I was trying to do with the book, for those who, I always think of it as a little bit of a primer how to conjugate things through when you have these kind of questions, or a companion, perhaps, you know, that can accompany people to ask these kind of questions in contexts where they're usually not asked. You know, we rarely ask, of course, the British Empire. Now, perhaps after the Meghan Markle interview, we ask them if they are sort of unassured about anything or something. But, you know, in the time frame that I'm looking at, this unassured, when it comes to certain aspects, there is this element of being unsure. But I think, you know, I think it is for the specialists to say and sort of look also for these moments, instead of letting them slide and treat them as aberrations. And, you know, I have to say, this sort of the Westernness of Germany, and I think I can't highlight this enough, is not just a stake for the German context itself. It's important for all of Europe that Germany is Western. Because when Germany isn't Western, then we have a completely different problem in terms of how are we going to tell the story of the Third Reich, for instance. Mark Masover, in this wonderful book, Dark Continent, shows how, you know, Europe was united in fascism, right? And when Germany is not Western, then Europe as a whole has a completely different problem. Thank you so much, Elena.
Thank you, Banu. I think, you know, both hearing the remarks and reading the passages of the book that we were able to, it's clear that you make a very strong sort of conceptual argument for the entanglement of disposition, state violence, and art history in all contexts. And yet at the same time, the cases, it's always a little bit awkward when you use this phrase or this term case, but Germany and Turkey both, because the histories of dispossession are so recent, and yet still you have this stark contrast in which in one context, that is Germany, the process of forgetting those histories of dispossession has largely achieved a silencing of the past in Trio's terms, whereas in Turkey, that's not so much the case, is perhaps what's so provocative about the book. We're reaching the technical end of our time, but I know that there was at least one more question, if you're willing to stay with us.
I'm super happy, and I feel bad. I feel like I've sort of talked too much perhaps, and I'm a bit surprised that it's already 4:30, but thank you so much for hanging, bearing with me, and I'm more than happy to stay, of course.
Oh, fantastic. Kevin, did you actually, you turned on your camera, so I took that as an indication that you might have a question. And then after that, Zizek also, I think, wants to chime in. So,
yes, I do. Thank you. So, first of all, thank you for this. It was very interesting for me. I'm always interested in this kind of intersection of anthropology and art, and this is actually the first question, primary question that I have, is that like I wasn't really aware of this connection until fairly recently. As a PhD student, I'm an anthropologist, by the way, and I had the unique opportunity of being a panelist at the Vienna Contemporary a few years ago. And I have to admit, I was a bit out of my element in the VIP room. I don't even like Prosecco, but it worked for me. And I was talking about my research project on, at the time, graffiti in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And first of all, I got the reaction that, oh, I've really done a good job of embracing the ethnographic turn in the arts, and asked if I had a gallerist. And of course, I was coming as an anthropologist, so this was a complete surprise for me. But I ended up kind of falling in with a group of artists and theoreticians from the former Yugoslavia, Grupa Spomenik, who were very actively engaged in not only reading the same literature that I was reading, but working on genocide, on nationalism, on boundaries, and they certainly came to deal directly with the question of national framing, because in the case of the former Yugoslavia, it very easily leads into nationalist framing, just by drawing those boundaries. And so I was kind of wondering if, in their work, they were actively working to disrupt national framing.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if you encountered anything similar in Turkey. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kevin, and thank you for sharing a little bit also about what you've sort of done, at least in the past. It sounds fascinating, and yes, this is something I also try to give an emphasis to. My issue is with the art world as such, rather than with the artwork. So for me, the sort of, I do an anthropology of art, which is an anthropology of the art world. And I say it this way because I find that understandings of art are very important to keep in mind when we look at the institutional framework of the art world. Because the art world is in this very contradictory manner a place where this, as I say in the introduction, where the sort of inherent goodness of art is constantly contested and reconstructed and disrupted and so on. And artists have to contend with that. Quite a part of and that's quite different from how they see their own practice and how they experience their own practice and how they do their work. But they are, every time they are in touch with the institutional frame of the art world, they have to contend with the national frame. And many of them, of course, actively are working against nationalism. Many of them, I would say. But that doesn't free them from having to contend with these structural problems. But how they answer, of course, can be very different. Yeah, but thank you for that question, and also because it's, I think, also an opportunity to make that point very clear. As I say, sometimes I worry that because I'm talking about these structural things of foregrounding them, that it's too over-determining sometimes, you know, or that it appears to be over-determining. Thank you, Ken. Nice to meet you too. Also.
Chichek.
Thank you very much, Banu. Your work has been amazingly inspiring for me for years, but this time I was left with a very interesting feeling while reading again your book. I was so surprised in terms of how far, in terms of the similarities of the set of tensions that you raise are actually relevant for my new project. That might, of course, be about my failure of detaching myself from my work. That's one thing. But I was really, I mean, this inherent good, the framings of common good, of spiritual experience, and the culturalization of spiritual experience in the way that is the case in Rumi's.
Mm-hmm.
Like the UNESCO's attempts to culturalize Rumi's material heritage and to make it appealing for a broader audience, and the way that it's consumed as an act of aesthetic consumption because it's musealized. So I was like, oh wow, it was really hard. So that's where I was left after finishing the first the introduction and the first chapter. So I'm in a very productive point, to say it roughly. And I have two questions. I would like to go back to the love affair between anthropology and arts. And I was wondering how far, I mean, the tensions around the emancipatory potential of both anthropology and art, besides of their implicatedness of state violence, different colonial regimes of thinking and all that, on the one hand. But on the other hand, in relation to the differentiation between the unmarked science/art and the political arts and science. So how to think about the love affair of between anthro and arts in these, within these tensions. And the second point that I have is about Stephen Osman's quotes that you use in order to juxtapose him with Mazovers while deconstructing how to put it shortly, the idea of Third Reich as a temporary breakdown in Europe's triumphal trajectory. I understand that you don't buy his argumentation, and I see the genealogy that you put him. But I also wonder about the idea that he puts forward, because it seems, it seemed to me interesting that you don't put it in a comparative framework, but you only use it for Germany. But yes, it speaks, I felt, so much for Turkey as well. The idea of not having the American and French optimism in the capacities of the humankind, and therefore being inclined more with the fear of anarchy more than tyranny. I was like, oh my God, although I got the reasons that we don't like the guy, I also get the intellectual lineage that he belongs to. This idea seemed to me very appealing as to ground a comparison between Turkey and Germany. So.
Yeah, I think It's a very brilliant observation to take, but I'm a bit hesitant, you know, because I wanted that passage. You are absolutely right. And sometimes when you, and I know that there's still tons to tab in terms of this reading together, reading against each other, reading in parallel, you know, of these two contexts. You know, that particular discussion that you referred to is my own spin on the historians' debate in Germany. You know, how do we understand the experience of the Third Reich and specifically the Holocaust within German history, right? And there's many ways of telling that story, and I didn't want to be the 150,000th book that sort of gives you the same overview. So I tried to do this through Zygmunt Baumann, Uli Linke's work, and then juxtapose it with Stephen Osmond. So that's what I'm trying to do there, and this idea is that, as you so concisely said, you know, was it a breakdown of a otherwise triumphantly or linearly progressing civilizationally course, or was this something else, right? And that's of course also the debate in the historians' debate on Germany and so on. I do wonder in the case of Turkey. On the one hand, I understand what you mean. It's very seductive to say that Turkey has been more sort of Turkey's national constellation has always been more worried about anarchy than about authoritarianism. But I have a slight objection, because for me, and that's not a good reason, I'm not saying this is a good reason to have this objection, but as you will see, as I will try to say, I have an objection because it's, of course, because it's a discourse that is used in Turkey, right? And that this is where you're actually trying to point to, for instance, for the 1980s coup, as you so rightly say. And you're right, I could have discussed that because, you know, there's still a lot of scholarship on Turkey that will repeat this idea that the 1980 coup had to come because there was the fear of anarchy on the street. And of course, I delegate the issue of or that discussion in the Turkish case into a footnote. But you're right, it's untapped potential to some extent. But I also didn't want to there were points where I had to make the decision, where do I want to follow parallel discourses and where do I sort of economize on it, because otherwise it becomes overstretched, you know. But you're right, it could have been just as well a good anchor or hook point to talk about how this kind of line of reasoning, both within and without, and politically and in scholarship on Turkey, this very same argument has been used as well to legitimize a whole range of atrocities, by the way. It's very perceptive. Thank you so much for pointing that out. The love affair between art and Ancho, I don't know what I can say about that you haven't in some ways already picked up upon. You know, I think in some ways, maybe I should say that this, in addition to the points that have been raised by you and in other ways by Kevin, I think already, is that I was a little bit, you know, the ethnographic turn, for instance, within works on within artistic practices, I've always, I think that it deserves further attention. But the reason why I've called it sort of, or condensed it or shorthanded it in the talk as the love affair, is that I think in some ways anthropology, like all disciplines, of course on all their subjects, but I think sometimes what I can see in my own discipline of anthropology is that it's sometimes very much in love with its own fabrications, right? And I take my cues here from Vincent Crapanzano. And I think there was especially in the mid-2000s till the mid-2010s, I'm not sure where we're at with this now, this sort of, where I sometimes wondered if this mutual affinity wasn't overstretched to the extent that we stopped asking about what are the ethics of scholarship, versus what are ethics within artistic practices, and are these always the same or not the same, right? My sense is that they might be quite different. This, again, I don't want to be over deterministic. Individual artists or individual anthropologists might say and practice this, see and practice this quite differently. But because I'm so concerned with the larger discourses that dominate those fields, you know, that dominate art and that dominate anthropology in a way, with regard to art, I do think that discussion sort of receded into the background a lot. And a lot of it was sort of this idea of that art is resistant, that it sort of is the place for agency, and it is all that, of course. But this sort of emphasis on these aspects of art were at the cost of forgetting how art is still being governed all the time, or attempted, or constantly has to fend off the kind of governance that sort of goes on and in the background incessantly. Yeah, I try to keep it. I sort of, it's a part of a longer discussion, and thank you for bringing it up, but I should sort of pause here and not overstretch everyone's time and hospitality, but thank you so much.
Thank you, Banu. We've kept you over long. I don't know if there are any more burning questions, Artem, just in the interest of giving everyone a chance to speak, if you have anything.
Just a short question, if I may. First of all, thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. It was also exciting to follow the discussion. I'm sorry, I'm not an expert on the subject, and sorry if my question sounds a bit naive, but you mentioned that in Turkey some art is political, and my question, is it possible to say that this political art is a form of political dissent and opposition in Turkey? And also it would be interesting to know whether government actors also use this political art to deliver certain political messages to the society.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Artem. Not at all. I think there is no, yeah, I am not a specialist on art either, by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, I'm a specialist on the way in which people talk about art. That doesn't mean I know much about art itself, you know, which for me is always a question mark. But what I sort of, the point I was trying to make is that in the perception, in the international perception, art from Turkey is often labeled political, right? And I was very interested in what this label of political does. But the point you made is, of course, very important. Contemporary artistic production in Turkey, indeed, to a large extent, is very openly engaged with the quote-unquote political realm in all ways and shapes and forms, as is, by the way, a lot of the contemporary artwork. The question is just how these approaches might differ, is of course an important question. Now, the second part of this is just a short answer. So I'm interested in both of these facets. You know, artists have a lot of different ways of expressing how they think that their individual works might be political or relate to the political, or might be politically transformative, or a part of a larger project that is resistant and so on, or oppositional. But what I was concerned with is this label that comes in the international circulation of art from Turkey, and what kind of work it does. The other question, does the state try to use this kind of political art as well? Yes, absolutely. But it's a problem. You can only do it to a certain extent. When we look at the example of Turkey, it's very interesting that between 2003 and 2007, at the very least, perhaps a little longer, but certainly not after 2013, the AKP government has, at strategic points, tried to act as a patron of contemporary artistic production, but not directly, because they don't want to spend money on it. And, you know, people are doing it anyway, if they spend money on it or not. And they have a sort of division of labor with private institutions. But Erdogan requested both the early opening of the Istanbul Modern to coincide with the EU accession negotiations and the early opening of Central Istanbul, which was a contemporary art museum, to coincide with the national elections. But what I also try to say in the book is why the national frame reinserts itself in that prism, or interpolates art and the art world all the time to come into that frame. Art is, qua definition, as a human practice, also very unwieldy for these projections. Yeah? And that is why we have censorship. That's why we have the distinction between art and non-art, right? On part of the state when this is made. And so the book tries to then at some points to show, how this unwieldiness plays out and what kind of frustration, if I may personify the state or anthropomorphize the state in this regard, what kind of challenges the state encounters when art shows exactly how unwieldy it is for these projections, both in the contemporary as well as in modern Turkish art. And some of you have read chapter 4, where I talk about, these artists who are being sent out to villages to show the real Turkish life apart from and then they come up with all of these paintings that don't reflect the modernizing narrative of the state, and that then are lost now, right? From 650, we only know where 83 are today, as an example. Jelena, did you want to say anything? No?
Well, thank you very much for your answer. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Artem. Thank you for staying with us. Thank you. Really.
This last discussion also raises a sort of whole set of other topics about the relative politicization of the public sphere in Turkey in general versus Germany, which, without wanting to be reductive, I think we could talk further about. Banu, do you write at all in the book in chapters that we didn't yet have the chance to read about the insan look on it?
No, not in the book. I've written about that. Yeah, I have a piece about that because, who deals with these kind of questions and one could not write about it. And it's a talk I've given a few times in different forms. But is there something specific you were thinking about?
Well, the reason it came to mind, this is a monument in the northeastern province of Kars, which was by this quite prominent sculptor, right, Mehmet Aksoy, and Erdogan in 2010, was it, decided that he was going to decry it as a monstrosity, and then I believe it was then removed. But it just struck me as that when you were giving this sort of timeline of AKP governance and its relationship to art and the arts, that might be a sort of key pivot point, perhaps. You could point that at, you could discuss various moments where that turn happened.
Yeah. I think I understood Artem's question a little bit towards more the genre of contemporary art per se. I think that the sort of, we had a bit of a chance to talk about one of your other wonderful events that you did on monuments. I think the monument form has a specific kind of problem. And there it was not just about art and what is tolerable in art and when is it not tolerable anymore, but that of course more than, or in equal measure, as it says something about contemporary artistic production and the sea change lived in the government through that. It also says something about how the politics of memory all of a sudden, or artistic memory carried, distributed through artistic means, all of a sudden became a completely different problem, sort of from a phase where the Armenian genocide was addressed to one, I mean, the conditions under which it was addressed and the frame of its being addressed is, of course, highly problematic, but it was at least addressed to a sort of denialist stance as well. So there's two things happening there at the same time.
Right, of course. Given the location of the monument on the border, particularly.
Exactly.
Perhaps this is a good point to wrap things up, since otherwise we'd end up opening the vast topic of, we didn't even talk about neo-Ottomanism, which is sort of an interesting, not erasure, but since it's something that we talk about a lot in our group, and I'm sure you have a lot of thoughts about this. I would be particularly interested in what if there is an analogy to neo-Ottomanism in Germany. What could we even talk about? But it's another discussion for another time, since I'm sure you're eager to have the rest of your evening in Berlin. So one last round of applause for Banu. Thank you everyone for staying with us.